The champagne flute felt cold in my hand as I watched Marcus Fletcher take the stage, his practiced smile gleaming under the spotlight. The ballroom buzzed with energy, investors, journalists, tech moguls all gathered for what the invitation called the future of digital innovation. I stood near the back, invisible among the crowd, my black dress blending into the shadows. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying that familiar confident tone that once made me believe in his vision. "Tonight marks the beginning of something extraordinary. Fletch Tech Solutions isn't just another consulting firm, we're revolutionizing how small businesses approach digital transformation." My fingers tightened around the glass stem. 3 months ago, I had sat in his corner office at Brennan & Associates, presenting this exact concept. The same slides, the same market research, the same revolutionary approach that he was now claiming as his own creation. "Our proprietary system," he continued, clicking to the next slide, "combines automated workflow analysis with personalized client onboarding. We call it the ADAPT framework: analyze, design, automate, perfect, transform." The applause erupted around me, but all I could hear was the echo of my own voice from that meeting in April. I had worked 18-hour days for 6 weeks developing ADAPT. I had coined that exact acronym. I had presented it to him with trembling hands in desperate hope, believing it would finally earn me the senior analyst position that had been dangled in front of me for 2 years. "Interesting concept," he had said, barely looking up from his phone. "But you're not ready for this level of responsibility, Alex. Maybe next year." Now, watching him bask in the spotlight while my ideas poured from his mouth, I felt that familiar burn in my chest. But my face remained perfectly composed. Years of hiding behind professional smiles had taught me that much. A woman in a red dress leaned toward her companion. "Fletcher's a genius. This could change everything for small businesses." "Absolutely brilliant," her friend agreed. "I heard he's already secured funding from 3 major venture capital firms." I took a slow sip of champagne, letting the bubbles steady my nerves. They had no idea they were witnessing the theft of 2 years of my life, packaged in Marcus's expensive suit and delivered with his trademark charisma. The presentation continued, each slide a twisted mirror of my original work. He had changed just enough details to make it his own, different fonts, altered graphics, restructured bullet points. But the heart of it, the innovation that made it special, that was mine. "The beauty of ADAPT," Marcus explained, gesturing toward a flowchart I had drawn on his whiteboard months ago, "is its scalability. Whether you're a family bakery or a growing tech startup, our system adapts to your specific needs." "Your system?" I thought, my smile never wavering. "Interesting choice of words, Marcus." Behind me, I caught fragments of conversations, investors calculating potential returns, competitors trying to poach talent, journalists already crafting their headlines. Everyone wanted a piece of Marcus Fletcher's revolutionary vision. If only they knew the real story. A waiter passed by, offering fresh champagne. I declined with a polite nod. My current glass still barely touched. I needed to stay sharp tonight. This wasn't just about watching Marcus steal credit for my work, this was about something much bigger. The presentation reached its climax as Marcus unveiled the Fletch Tech logo, a sleek geometric design that pulsed across the massive screen. The crowd murmured approval. But I simply smiled. That logo looked very familiar indeed. "Questions?" Marcus asked, scanning the audience with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. A venture capitalist in the front row raised his hand. "Marcus, this is impressive work. How long did it take your team to develop this framework?" "About 8 months of intensive research and development," Marcus replied smoothly. "We wanted to make sure we got it right the first time." 8 months. I almost laughed out loud. He couldn't even get his lies straight. I had submitted my ADAPT proposal exactly 14 weeks ago. But then again, accuracy had never been Marcus's strong suit. "Any other questions?" he asked. that practiced smile still plastered across his face. Silence settled over the room. Marcus looked pleased. Probably assuming his presentation had been so comprehensive that no one could find fault with it. He had always been terrible at reading rooms. Well then, he concluded. Let's celebrate the future of business innovation. The crowd erupted in applause again, and Marcus stepped down from the stage. Immediately surrounded by eager investors and potential clients. I watched him work the room, shaking hands and exchanging business cards. Building an empire on the foundation of my stolen ideas. But here's what Marcus didn't know. What none of them knew, I had been planning for this moment since the day he rejected my promotion. Every handshake he made tonight, every deal he discussed. Every promise he offered, it was all building towards something he couldn't possibly imagine. I finished my champagne in one smooth swallow and set the empty glass on a nearby table. As I walked toward the exit, I pulled out my phone and sent a simple text message, Phase 1 complete. Ready for Phase 2. The response came back immediately, looking forward to tomorrow's board meeting. Your presentation should be very interesting. I slipped my phone back into my purse and stepped into the cool night air. Tomorrow. Marcus Fletcher would learn what it felt like to watch someone else take credit for everything he had built. The only difference was, this time, it would be completely legal. Thoroughly documented, and absolutely devastating. As I waited for my taxi, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Marcus had taught me something valuable during my time at Brennan & Associates. In business, as in revenge, timing is everything. The taxi ride home gave me time to think. To plan, to remember. 3 months ago, sitting in that sterile conference room, I had believed my career was finally taking off. Now I understood it was just the beginning of something far more important. My apartment was exactly as I had left it, neat, organized, purposeful. The living room looked normal enough to any casual visitor, but the second bedroom told a different story. I had converted it into what I privately called my war room, though that seemed dramatic even to me sometimes. I flicked on the lights and surveyed my work. 3 months of careful planning covered every available surface. Printed emails, financial records, patent applications. Meeting minutes, everything meticulously organized and cross-referenced. The wall looked like something from a detective show, strings connecting different pieces of evidence. But this wasn't fiction. This was my life's work, stolen and repackaged. I kicked off my heels and walked to the timeline I had constructed along the far wall. It started in January, when I first began developing the ideas that would become Adapt. Every meeting, every email, every late night spent perfecting the framework was documented with timestamps and supporting evidence. January 15th, initial concept sketches for automated workflow analysis. February 3rd, first functional prototype of client onboarding system. February 28th, complete market research analysis showing demand for scalable digital transformation tools. March 12th, Adapt framework fully developed and tested. April 8th, formal presentation to Marcus Fletcher requesting promotion to senior analyst. April 8th, promotion denied. Ideas dismissed as not ready for implementation. The timeline continued through the spring and summer, documenting Marcus's sudden departure from Brennan & Associates. His hasty formation of Fletch Tech Solutions, and his aggressive pursuit of funding using a business plan that looked suspiciously familiar. I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder labeled insurance policy. Inside were dozens of files I had been collecting since April 9th. The day after Marcus crushed my promotion hopes. Email drafts, code repositories, design files, everything that proved the true origin of what Marcus was now calling his revolutionary innovation. The beauty of working in tech consulting was that everything left a digital trail. Every iteration of my Adapt framework had been automatically backed up to the company servers. Every email I sent contained timestamps that couldn't be altered. Every meeting had been scheduled through corporate calendars that maintained perfect records. Marcus had been sloppy in his theft. Probably assuming I was too crushed to fight back. He had taken my files, my ideas, even my exact wording in several cases. But he had missed one crucial detail: I had copyright and intellectual property documentation for everything. My phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer, Harrison Walsh. Saw the Fletch Tech announcement online. You were right, he used everything. Are you ready for tomorrow? I typed back quickly, more than ready. The evidence is overwhelming. Harrison had been skeptical when I first approached him in May. A mid-level consultant taking on a successful entrepreneur seemed like David versus Goliath. But when I showed him the evidence, the clear timeline, the documented theft, the blatant intellectual property violations, his attitude changed completely. This isn't just workplace dispute, he had told me during our second meeting. This is systematic theft of intellectual property. And with the right approach, it's completely prosecutable. The right approach had taken months to develop. We couldn't just file a lawsuit and hope for the best. Marcus had money, connections, and a legal team that specialized in making problems disappear. We needed something more sophisticated, more decisive. We needed Marcus to publicly commit to the stolen ideas before revealing their true origin. That's why tonight had been so important. Marcus had just presented my ADAPT framework to a room full of investors, journalists, and industry leaders. He had claimed it as his own creation, put his name on it, and promised to build an entire company around it. Every word had been recorded. Every slide would be archived, every promise would be remembered. I walked to my desk and opened the thick folder labeled Phase 2. Tomorrow's board meeting at Brennan & Associates would be interesting indeed. 3 months ago, Marcus had rejected my promotion request, claiming my ideas weren't ready for implementation. Tomorrow, I would be presenting those same unready ideas to the company's board of directors, along with a detailed timeline showing exactly when they were developed. The irony was perfect. Marcus had left Brennan & Associates to start his own company, burning bridges and taking several clients with him. The board was still angry about his departure, especially since he had poached their best accounts. They would be very interested to learn that his revolutionary new business was built entirely on intellectual property he had stolen from one of their own employees. I pulled out the presentation slides I had been preparing for weeks. Unlike Marcus's flashy production, mine focused on facts, timelines, and evidence. Each slide was carefully documented, each claim supported by multiple sources. The board would see not just what Marcus had stolen, but exactly how he had done it. The presentation started with a simple question: what happens when a rejected promotion request becomes a multi-million-dollar business plan? From there, it would tell the story chronologically: my development of ADAPT, Marcus's rejection of my promotion, his sudden departure from the company, and his recent launch of Fletch Tech Solutions using ideas he had claimed weren't ready for implementation. But the real bombshell would come in the final slides. Not only had Marcus stolen my intellectual property, but he had also violated several non-compete clauses in his employment contract. By using ideas developed at Brennan & Associates to start a competing business, he had opened himself up to massive legal liability. The board wouldn't just be angry about the theft, they would see it as a direct attack on their company's competitive advantage. I printed a final copy of the presentation and slipped it into my briefcase. Tomorrow would change everything, but tonight I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. 3 months ago, Marcus had looked at my work and decided I wasn't worth promoting. Tomorrow, he would learn exactly how much that mistake was going to cost him. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Harrison Walsh. "Alex," he said without preamble. "I just got off the phone with my contact at the patent office. Marcus filed provisional patents for the ADAPT framework last week, claiming invention date of June 1st. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. But I have documentation proving I developed it in March." "I know, and that's exactly what we need." His patent filing just gave us additional evidence of fraud. He's not just stealing your ideas, he's lying to federal agencies about when he invented them. The knot loosened slightly. So this actually helps us? It makes our case even stronger. patent fraud carries serious penalties, including criminal charges in extreme cases. Marcus just escalated this from civil intellectual property theft to potential federal crimes. After hanging up, I sat in my war room surrounded by 3 months of careful planning. Marcus had always underestimated people, especially women, especially subordinates. It was the kind of arrogance that came from years of success built on other people's work. Tomorrow, that arrogance would finally catch up with him. I turned off the lights and headed to my bedroom, but sleep felt impossible. Instead, I lay awake thinking about the meeting that had started it all. Marcus's dismissive tone. His barely concealed contempt, his assumption that I would simply accept rejection and move on. "You're not ready for this level of responsibility, Alex," he had said. "Maybe next year." Tomorrow, I would show him exactly how ready I was. The Brennan and Associates building looked different at 7 a.m. Quieter and more dignified than during the usual rush hour chaos. I had arrived early, partly to prepare and partly because I hadn't slept well. 3 months of planning were about to culminate in the next 2 hours. I sat in my car for a few minutes, reviewing my notes one final time. The board meeting was scheduled for 8:30. But I wanted to arrive early enough to set up my presentation and mentally prepare for what would either be the most important moment of my career or a spectacular failure. My phone displayed several text messages from Harrison Walsh, final reminders about legal strategy and encouragement to stay focused on facts rather than emotions. The evidence was overwhelming, he assured me, but board meetings could be unpredictable. I gathered my briefcase and walked through the lobby, greeting the security guard with my usual professional smile. Nothing about my appearance suggested this was anything other than another routine morning at the office. That was intentional. I had learned the value of hiding in plain sight. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, I was surprised to find Amanda Hoffman, the company's head of strategic development, already waiting in the conference room. "Alex," she said, looking up from her tablet. "I'm glad you arrived early. I wanted to discuss your presentation before the others get here." My heart rate quickened. Amanda had been one of my strongest supporters over the past 2 years. But she was also politically astute enough to distance herself from anything that might damage her own position. "Is there a problem?" I asked, setting down my briefcase and trying to keep my voice steady. "No problem at all," she replied, her expression unreadable. "Actually, quite the opposite. I've been following Marcus Fletcher's activities since he left the company, and last night's Fletch Tech announcement was very illuminating." I felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. "You saw the presentation?" "I was there," Amanda said simply. "Invited as a potential investor, actually. Marcus has been very aggressive about courting our business partners since starting his own firm." She paused, studying my face carefully. The interesting thing about his presentation was how familiar it seemed. Almost like I had heard those ideas before, in a different context. I chose my words carefully. "What kind of context?" "The kind where a talented analyst presents innovative solutions to problems the company has been struggling with for months," Amanda replied. "The kind where that same analyst gets passed over for promotion despite developing exactly the sort of breakthrough thinking we claim to value." The silence stretched between us, loaded with implication. Amanda was giving me an opening, but I needed to be sure about her intentions before committing to anything. "Amanda," I said finally, "if you had evidence that a former employee was using company intellectual property to compete against us, what would you do?" She smiled. The first genuine expression I had seen from her that morning. "I would make sure the board understood the full scope of that threat to our competitive position. And I would ensure that any employee who brought such evidence forward was properly recognized for their diligence and loyalty." The door opened, interrupting our conversation. Board members began filing in: Jonathan Brennan, the company founder; Patricia Santos, the CFO; Michael Torres, head of client relations; and 3 external board members who provided oversight and strategic guidance. As they settled into their seats, I felt the weight of the moment. These people controlled my career, my future, and potentially Marcus Fletcher's downfall. The next hour would determine whether justice prevailed or whether I had just destroyed my own professional life for nothing. Jonathan Brennan called the meeting to order with his usual brisk efficiency. Before we begin with regular business, Amanda has requested time for a special presentation. Alex Martinez from our strategic consulting team has some information she believes is relevant to our competitive position. All eyes turned to me. I stood, walked to the front of the room, and connected my laptop to the projection system. The first slide appeared on the wall: intellectual property theft, a case study in corporate espionage. 3 months ago, I began, my voice steadier than I had expected. I requested a promotion to senior analyst based on my development of an innovative framework for automated business consulting. That request was denied by Marcus Fletcher, who claimed my ideas weren't ready for implementation. I clicked to the next slide, showing the timeline I had constructed. Last night, Mr. Fletcher used those same unready ideas to launch his own consulting firm, claiming them as his original innovation and securing millions in venture capital funding. The room was completely silent. Patricia Santos leaned forward, studying the timeline with intense focus. Michael Torres was already taking notes. The framework I developed is called Adapt, Analyze, Design, Automate, Perfect, Transform. As you can see from these email timestamps, I created and tested this system between January and March of this year. I clicked through several slides showing my original documentation, code samples, and market research. Each piece of evidence was carefully dated and verified. Yesterday evening, Marcus Fletcher presented this exact framework to a room full of investors, using the same acronym, the same methodology, and even some of the same wording from my original proposal. Jonathan Brennan interrupted for the first time. Alex, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence that Marcus deliberately stole your work? I have overwhelming evidence, I replied, clicking to a side-by-side comparison of my original slides and screenshots from Marcus's presentation. As you can see, he didn't just steal the concepts. In many cases, he copied my exact language and formatting. The next series of slides documented Marcus's departure from the company, his formation of Fletch Tech Solutions, and his systematic recruitment of our clients using my intellectual property as bait. But the most serious issue, I continued, is that Marcus has filed provisional patents for the ADAPT framework, claiming an invention date of June 1st, 2 months after I presented these ideas to him and 4 months after I actually developed them. Patricia Santos looked up sharply. Patent fraud? Potentially, yes. I have timestamped documentation proving that every component of the ADAPT framework was developed here, at Brennan and Associates, using company resources and during company time. That makes it our intellectual property, not his. I clicked to the final slide, showing the legal implications. Marcus has violated his non-compete agreement, stolen proprietary intellectual property, and potentially committed federal patent fraud. But more importantly for this company, he's using our innovations to compete directly against us in markets we've been trying to penetrate for years. The silence that followed was deafening. Board members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to anger to calculation. Finally, Jonathan Brennan spoke. Alex, assuming everything you've presented is accurate, what do you recommend we do about it? This was the moment I had been preparing for. I recommend that Brennan and Associates file for immediate legal protection of our intellectual property, pursue civil action against Fletch Tech Solutions for theft and contract violations, and report the patent fraud to federal authorities. And personally? Amanda Hoffman asked. What do you want out of this? I had expected this question, but it still caught me off guard. What did I want? Justice? Revenge? Recognition? I want the promotion that was denied to me 3 months ago, I said simply. I want credit for the work I've done. And I want to make sure that no other employee has their innovation stolen and their career destroyed by someone they trusted. Michael Torres cleared his throat. Alex. You mentioned that you've been tracking Marcus's activities for months. How long have you known about his theft? I suspected something was wrong when he left the company so suddenly after rejecting my promotion, I admitted. But I didn't have proof until I started documenting his public statements and comparing them to my original work. The evidence I've presented today was compiled over the past 3 months. So you've been conducting your own investigation, Patricia Santos observed. That shows impressive initiative and attention to detail. Jonathan Brennan looked around the table at his fellow board members. I think we need to discuss this privately. Alex, would you mind stepping out for a few minutes while we deliberate? I nodded, gathered my materials, and walked out into the hallway. The next 10 minutes felt like hours. Everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed. Everything I had planned came down to whatever conversation was happening behind that closed door. When Amanda Hoffman finally called me back in, the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. Instead of skeptical board members evaluating my claims, I faced a group of corporate executives who looked ready for war. Alex, Jonathan Brennan began, the board has voted unanimously to pursue all available legal remedies against Marcus Fletcher and Fletch Tech Solutions. We're also implementing an immediate intellectual property protection protocol to prevent future theft. He paused, looking directly at me. We're also promoting you to senior analyst, effective immediately. With a 15% salary increase and a project bonus for your development of the ADAPT framework. Relief flooded through me, but Jonathan wasn't finished. More importantly, we're putting you in charge of our new intellectual property protection initiative. Your investigation skills and attention to detail make you uniquely qualified to ensure this never happens again. I felt tears threatening but managed to keep my composure. Thank you. All of you. I won't let you down. As the meeting concluded and board members began filing out, Amanda Hoffman approached me with a satisfied smile. You know, she said quietly, Marcus Fletcher made 2 critical mistakes. First, he underestimated you. Second, he forgot that stealing from Brennan and Associates means stealing from people who don't forgive or forget. I packed up my presentation materials. My hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and relief. Phase 2 was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Marcus Fletcher was about to learn what happened when someone tried to build an empire on stolen foundations. The legal machinery moved faster than I had expected. By Thursday afternoon, just 3 days after my board presentation, Harrison Walsh called with updates that exceeded my wildest hopes. Alex. I need you to sit down for this, he said, his voice carrying a mix of excitement and disbelief. Fletch Tech Solutions just received simultaneous cease and desist orders for patent infringement, intellectual property theft, and breach of contract violations. I was in my new office, a corner space with actual windows that came with my promotion, organizing files for the Intellectual Property Protection Initiative. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now responsible for preventing exactly the kind of theft I had experienced. How did Marcus react? I asked, closing my laptop to focus entirely on the conversation. That's the beautiful part, Harrison continued. He tried to bluff his way through it. His lawyers sent back a response claiming that all Fletch Tech innovations were original developments with no connection to his previous employment. But we have proof that's false. Overwhelming proof. And that's where Marcus made his biggest mistake. By denying any connection to your work, he's made it impossible to claim fair use or shared development. He's essentially admitted to either theft or perjury. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city traffic through my new window. 3 months ago, I had been stuck in a windowless cubicle, watching Marcus Fletcher's career advance while mine stagnated. Now he was facing potential criminal charges while I was building a new department from the ground up. There's more, Harrison said. The Patent Office has flagged his ADAPT applications for investigation. When they compare his filing dates to your documented development timeline, he's going to face federal fraud charges. How serious are those charges? Serious enough that his investors are already getting nervous. Patent fraud can result in fines up to $1 million and up to 5 years in federal prison. Even if he avoids criminal prosecution, the civil penalties could destroy him financially. My phone beeped with an incoming call. The caller ID showed Amanda Hoffman. Harrison, I need to take this call. Can we continue this later? Of course. But Alex? Enjoy this moment. You've earned it. I switched to Amanda's call. Hi Amanda. What's going on? Turn on Channel 7 News, she said without preamble. You're going to want to see this. I found the remote and flipped to the local business news. A reporter was standing outside the Fletch Tech Solutions office building, speaking directly to the camera. Facing serious legal challenges just days after their high-profile launch. Sources close to the situation confirm that the company is being sued for intellectual property theft by their founder's former employer, Brennan and Associates. The camera cut to footage from Marcus's presentation 3 nights ago, showing him confidently explaining the ADAPT framework to his audience of investors. Seeing it again, knowing what I knew now, made his lies even more infuriating. According to court documents filed yesterday, the reporter continued. The ADAPT system that forms the foundation of Fletch Tech's business model was allegedly developed by a Brennan and Associates employee who was denied promotion just months before Fletcher left to start his own company. The screen showed a photo of Marcus looking significantly less confident than he had during his presentation. This must have been taken recently, probably as he was leaving his lawyer's office. Fletcher has denied all allegations. But legal experts say the evidence presented by Brennan and Associates appears comprehensive and damaging. We reached out to Fletch Tech Solutions for comment, but have not received a response. Amanda's voice came back on the line. Are you watching? This is surreal, I admitted. 3 days ago, he was on top of the world. And now his investors are jumping ship faster than passengers on the Titanic. I heard from Patricia that 2 of his major funding commitments were withdrawn this morning. I muted the television but kept watching as the reporter continued her story. Seeing Marcus's downfall play out on the evening news felt like vindication, but also strangely hollow. I had won, but the victory felt less satisfying than I had expected. Amanda, can I ask you something? Of course. When you saw Marcus's presentation the other night, how long did it take you to realize he had stolen my work? There was a pause before she answered. About 30 seconds. The moment he said ADAPT framework, I knew exactly where he had gotten it. You presented those same ideas to 3 different department heads over the past year. Everyone knew they were yours. Then why didn't anyone speak up when Marcus rejected my promotion? Another pause, longer this time. Because Marcus was the head of strategic development and challenging him publicly would have been career suicide for anyone below board level. It's not right, Alex. But it's the reality of corporate politics. I understood, but it still stung. How many people had watched Marcus steal credit for my work and said nothing? How many had known the truth but chosen silence over justice? The important thing, Amanda continued, is that you didn't let it slide. You documented everything. Built an airtight case, and forced the truth into the open. That takes courage and intelligence that most people don't possess. After ending the call, I sat in my office watching the sun set over the city. My computer showed 17 new emails. Most of them congratulations from colleagues who had just heard about my promotion. A few were from former classmates who had seen the news coverage and wanted to reconnect. But one email stood out from the rest. The sender was Marcus Fletcher. And the subject line read simply, "We need to talk." I stared at the message for several minutes before opening it. Alex, I know you must be feeling vindicated right now, but this legal action is going to destroy both of us. Fletch Tech has investors, employees, and clients who will be hurt if this continues. Whatever issues you have with me personally, think about the collateral damage. I'm prepared to discuss a settlement that recognizes your contributions while allowing both our companies to move forward. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. Marcus, I read the message 3 times, each reading making me angrier than the last. Even facing the collapse of his stolen empire, Marcus couldn't bring himself to admit wrongdoing. He was still trying to manipulate the situation, still assuming he could negotiate his way out of consequences. But what infuriated me most was his implication that I was being unreasonable. 3 months ago, I had presented him with innovative ideas that could have advanced both our careers. He had dismissed those ideas and denied me the promotion I had earned. Now, facing the consequences of his theft, he wanted to negotiate. I forwarded the email to Harrison Walsh with a simple note, "For the file." No response needed. Within minutes, Harrison called back. "Alex, whatever you do, don't respond to that email. He's trying to create evidence that you're open to settlement discussions, which could complicate our legal position." I wasn't planning to respond, I assured him. But I have to admit, part of me wants to tell him exactly what I think of his reasonable offer. I understand the temptation, but silence is more powerful than any response you could give. Let him wonder what you're thinking. Let him imagine how much worse this could get. That evening, I worked late in my new office, setting up the intellectual property protection protocols that would prevent future employees from experiencing what I had been through. The work was satisfying in a way that went beyond personal vindication. I was building systems that would protect other people's innovations and careers. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Alex Martinez," I answered professionally. "Ms. Martinez, this is Beverly Chin from Channel 7 Business News. I'm working on a follow-up story about the Fletch Tech situation, and I was hoping you might be available for an interview." My first instinct was to decline. I had never wanted to be the public face of this battle, I just wanted justice and recognition for my work. But then I thought about all the other employees who might be watching, people who had seen their own ideas stolen or their careers stalled by unethical managers. "What kind of interview?" I asked. "Nothing confrontational," Beverly assured me. "We're interested in the broader implications of intellectual property theft in the consulting industry. Your case has highlighted some serious issues about how companies protect their employees' innovations." I agreed to meet with her the following day, with the understanding that Harrison Walsh would be present and that I would focus on the systemic issues rather than personal grievances against Marcus. As I finally headed home that night, I reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, I had been an overlooked analyst with a stolen idea and a carefully constructed plan for justice. Tonight, I was the head of a new corporate initiative, with a platform to speak about protecting intellectual property and a legal victory that was already making headlines. Marcus Fletcher had taught me something valuable. Though not intentionally, sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better. The Channel 7 interview took place in their downtown studio, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Beverly Chin was professional and well-prepared, having clearly done her research on both my case and the broader issues surrounding intellectual property theft. "Alex," she began once the cameras were rolling, "your situation with Fletch Tech Solutions has highlighted something that many people don't realize happens in corporate America. Can you explain what intellectual property theft looks like in the consulting industry?" I had practiced this answer with Harrison, focusing on the systemic issues rather than personal grievances. Intellectual property theft in consulting often starts with something that seems innocent. An employee presents innovative ideas to their supervisor. Those ideas get rejected or shelved, and then suddenly they appear as part of someone else's project or business plan. What makes this particularly damaging? In consulting, ideas are our primary currency. When someone steals a colleague's intellectual property, they're not just taking credit for work, they're potentially destroying that person's career advancement and undermining the innovation culture that companies depend on. Beverly leaned forward slightly. "Your case involved more than just stolen ideas, though. Can you walk us through the timeline?" I explained the development of Adapt, Marcus's rejection of my promotion, and his subsequent use of my framework to launch his own company. I was careful to stick to documented facts and avoid emotional language. But the story itself was powerful enough. What advice would you give to other employees who suspect their ideas have been stolen? Document everything, I said firmly. Keep copies of your work, timestamp your communications, and maintain detailed records of meetings and presentations. Most importantly, don't assume that staying silent will protect your job. Silence usually just enables more theft. After the interview, Beverly walked me to the lobby. Off the record, she said quietly, I've been covering business news for 15 years, and I've never seen a case this well documented or this clearly prosecuted. You've probably prevented this from happening to dozens of other people. That afternoon, I returned to the office to find my email inbox flooded with messages. The Channel 7 interview had been picked up by several business news websites, and my story was spreading across social media faster than I had expected. Most of the messages were supportive colleagues congratulating me, business school classmates expressing admiration, and complete strangers sharing their own experiences with idea theft. But a few were unsettling. One email, from an address I didn't recognize, read, "You think you've won. But this is just the beginning. Destroying someone's career has consequences." I forwarded it to Harrison Walsh in building security, then tried to focus on my work. Intimidation tactics were probably a sign of desperation, which meant our legal strategy was working. Around 3 o'clock, Amanda Hoffman stopped by my office with an update that made the threatening email seem insignificant. "Alex, I just got off the phone with Patricia Santos. Fletch Tech Solutions missed their first investor payment deadline yesterday. 2 more funding commitments were withdrawn this morning. And their lease agreement is being reviewed by their landlord. How bad is it for them? Bad enough that Marcus is probably going to lose everything. His company was entirely dependent on the credibility of the ADAPT framework, and without that, he has no competitive advantage and no way to attract new investors." I felt a complex mix of emotions, satisfaction at seeing justice served, but also a strange sadness at witnessing someone's complete professional destruction. Even someone who had stolen from me. "There's something else," Amanda continued. 3 of his employees contacted our HR department this morning. They want to know if we're hiring. People are jumping ship already. Wouldn't you? They joined Fletch Tech thinking they were part of the next big innovation in business consulting. Now they're discovering their entire company is built on stolen intellectual property. The smart ones are getting out before the criminal charges start flying. That evening, I was working late again when my desk phone rang. The caller ID showed the main reception number. "Ms. Martinez?" The voice belonged to Jake, our evening security guard. "There's someone here to see you. Says his name is Marcus Fletcher." My heart rate spiked. Did he say what he wanted? He claims it's urgent business that can't wait until tomorrow. Should I tell him you're not available? I considered my options. Part of me wanted to see Marcus face to face, to witness firsthand how his arrogance had crumbled under the weight of his own lies. But Harrison had been clear about avoiding any direct contact that could complicate our legal position. Tell him I'm not available, I decided. If he wants to communicate with me, he can go through our legal department. Will do. He doesn't look too happy about it. But that's not your problem. After Jake hung up, I sat in my office wondering what Marcus had wanted to say. An apology? Another attempt at negotiation? A final desperate plea for mercy? It didn't matter. The time for conversation had passed months ago, when I had presented my ideas in good faith and he had dismissed them with contempt. Now we were beyond words, we were in the realm of consequences. I gathered my things and headed for the elevator, but curiosity got the better of me. Instead of going directly to the parking garage, I took a detour past the main lobby windows. Marcus was standing on the sidewalk outside, talking animatedly on his phone. Even from a distance, I could see the strain in his posture, the tension in his gestures. 3 months ago, he had been the confident executive who controlled my career prospects. Now he looked like a man watching his world collapse in real time. As I watched, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Marcus ended his phone call and got into the passenger seat. Through the rear window, I could see him slumped forward, his head in his hands. The sight should have filled me with triumph, but instead I felt oddly empty. Justice had been served, my career was advancing. And my innovations were finally getting the recognition they deserved. So why did victory feel so hollow? The drive home gave me time to process the day's events. The news interview, the threatening email, Marcus's visit, everything was moving faster than I had anticipated. What had started as a carefully planned response to workplace injustice was becoming a public spectacle with implications I hadn't fully considered. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment complex. Harrison Walsh's name appeared on the screen. "Alex, I just heard about Fletcher's visit to your office. Good call on refusing to see him. Any idea what he wanted?" "Probably to make a direct plea for settlement talks. His lawyers are getting desperate, they know the evidence is overwhelming. And they're trying to find any angle that might reduce the damage. How much longer do you think this will take? The civil case could drag on for months. But the patent fraud investigation is moving quickly. The federal authorities don't mess around with intellectual property crimes. Especially when the evidence is this clear." I parked and sat in my car, looking up at my apartment building. 3 months ago, I had converted my spare bedroom into a war room, filling it with evidence and timelines and plans for justice. Now that room felt like a museum of old grievances. A reminder of battles that were essentially won. "Harrison, what happens to Marcus if he's convicted of patent fraud?" "Best case scenario for him? Massive fines. Permanent damage to his professional reputation, and civil liability that could bankrupt him. Worst case? Federal prison time and complete professional destruction." After hanging up, I climbed the stairs to my apartment and stood in the doorway of my former war room. The walls were still covered with timelines and evidence, but it all seemed unnecessary now. The battle was over, the war had been won. I began taking down the papers, carefully filing away the evidence that had brought down Marcus Fletcher's stolen empire. Each document told part of the story: emails, timestamps, code samples, meeting notes. Together, they formed an unbreakable chain of proof that had turned the tables on intellectual property theft. As I worked, I thought about the threatening email I had received earlier. Someone, probably Marcus or one of his supporters, was angry about his downfall and wanted me to know it. But threats were just noise now, the desperate flailing of people who had bet everything on stolen ideas and lost. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number: "Saw you on the news. Proud of you for fighting back." A former Brennan colleague who watched it happen. Then another: "Your story inspired me to speak up about my own stolen project. Thank you." And another: "Currently documenting my boss's idea theft. Your case gave me hope." I realized that my battle with Marcus had become something larger than personal justice. It had become a symbol for everyone who had watched their innovations stolen, their careers stalled, and their contributions ignored. By refusing to stay silent, I had given others permission to fight back. The hollow feeling began to fade, replaced by something more substantial. This wasn't just about revenge or even justice, it was about changing a culture that allowed intellectual property theft to flourish in corporate environments. I finished clearing the war room and transformed it back into a normal spare bedroom. The battle was over, but the work of protecting other people's innovations was just beginning. Friday morning brought news that even Harrison Walsh hadn't expected. I was reviewing intellectual property protection protocols when he called with an update that would change everything. "Alex, you need to hear this. The federal patent investigation just uncovered something massive. Marcus didn't just steal your ideas, he's been systematically pilfering intellectual property for years." I stopped typing and focused entirely on the call. "What do you mean?" The investigators found evidence of at least 6 other instances of idea theft spanning his entire career. Former colleagues from 3 different companies have come forward with documentation showing that Marcus built his reputation on other people's work. The magnitude of this revelation hit me immediately. So I wasn't his first victim. Not even close. The pattern is almost identical in every case. Marcus identifies promising ideas from subordinates, rejects them officially, then incorporates them into his own projects or presentations months later. You are just the first person to document it thoroughly enough to build a legal case. I thought about all the times Marcus had been praised for his innovative thinking. All the promotions and accolades he had received for his groundbreaking concepts. How much of his entire career had been built on stolen intellectual property? What happens now? The federal authorities are expanding their investigation to include potential racketeering charges. If they can prove Marcus engaged in a pattern of intellectual property theft across multiple companies, he could face decades in federal prison. After Harrison hung up, I sat in my office trying to process this information. My personal battle with Marcus had inadvertently exposed a career-long pattern of systematic theft. I had thought I was fighting for justice in a single case, but apparently I had uncovered something much larger. Amanda Hoffman appeared in my doorway around 10 o'clock. Holding a tablet and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "Alex, have you seen the business news this morning? I've been focused on work." "Why?" She held up her tablet, showing a headline from the Wall Street Journal: Fletch Tech founder under federal investigation for pattern of intellectual property theft. The article detailed the expanded investigation, interviewing several of Marcus's former colleagues who had come forward with their own stories of stolen ideas. My case was mentioned as the catalyst that prompted others to speak out, but the scope of Marcus's theft was far broader than I had imagined. "This is incredible," I said, reading through the article. "I had no idea it went back this far." Neither did anyone else, apparently. "But your documentation was so thorough that it gave investigators a template for finding similar patterns in his previous positions. You didn't just solve your own case, you helped solve 6 others." One quote in the article particularly caught my attention. Dr. Patricia Valdez, a former colleague from Marcus's previous company, said, "I developed a client retention algorithm that became the foundation of our most successful product line. Marcus presented it as his own innovation and received a promotion and substantial bonus. I was laid off 6 months later in a restructuring that eliminated my position but kept my algorithm." The pattern was sickeningly familiar. Marcus had perfected a system of intellectual property theft that allowed him to advance his career while destroying the people who actually did the innovative work. "Amanda," I said, looking up from the tablet, "how many people do you think Marcus has done this to over the years? Based on what the investigators are finding." "Dozens. Possibly more. He's been systematically stealing ideas for at least 8 years, maybe longer." The phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed Harrison Walsh again. "Alex, turn on Channel 7. They're running a special report about the expanded investigation. And they want to interview you again." I found the remote and switched to the business news channel. Beverly Chin was standing outside the federal courthouse, speaking directly to the camera. What began as a single case of intellectual property theft has now expanded into a federal investigation spanning multiple companies and potentially dozens of victims. Marcus Fletcher, the founder of Fletch Tech Solutions, is facing charges that could result in decades in federal prison. The screen showed photos of Marcus from various points in his career, accepting awards, speaking at conferences, posing with other executives. Knowing what I knew now, each image felt like evidence of fraud. The investigation was prompted by documentation provided by Alex Martinez, a Brennan and Associates analyst who refused to let her stolen ideas disappear without a fight. Ms. Martinez's meticulous record-keeping has provided investigators with a template for identifying similar patterns of theft throughout Fletcher's career. Beverly's voice continued over footage of the Fletch Tech office building, now showing for lease signs in several windows. Legal experts say this case could set new precedents for prosecuting intellectual property theft in corporate environments. Amanda muted the television. Alex. They want to interview you for the expanded story. Are you interested? I considered the implications. My original goal had been personal justice, recognition for my work and consequences for Marcus's theft. But now the case had become something much larger. A potential catalyst for protecting intellectual property rights across the entire industry. Yes, I decided. If my story can help other victims come forward, then I want to tell it. The interview was scheduled for Monday afternoon, giving me the weekend to prepare. But first, I wanted to understand the full scope of what my documentation had uncovered. Harrison arranged for me to meet with Agent Rachel Morrison, the federal investigator leading the case against Marcus. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s. But she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen every type of corporate crime imaginable. Ms. Martinez, she began, settling into a chair across from my desk. Your documentation is the most comprehensive case of intellectual property theft I've encountered in 15 years of federal investigation. Thank you, but I have to admit, I was just trying to protect my own work. I had no idea it would lead to this. That's what makes it so powerful, Agent Morrison replied. You weren't building a case against Fletcher specifically, you were simply documenting the truth about your own situation. That kind of authentic evidence is incredibly difficult to fabricate or discredit. She opened a thick folder and spread several documents across my desk. Based on your template, we've identified similar patterns at Fletcher's 3 previous employers. Same methodology, same timeline. Same outcome, promising employees present innovative ideas, Fletcher rejects them officially, then incorporates them into his own projects. Looking at the documents, I could see the clear pattern. Email exchanges that mirrored my own experience, promotion requests that were denied for suspicious reasons, and subsequent presentations by Marcus that contained obvious intellectual property theft. What I don't understand, I said, is how he got away with this for so long. Several factors, Agent Morrison explained. First, most victims assumed they were isolated cases. They didn't realize they were part of a larger pattern. Second, Fletcher was careful to space out his thefts and target people who were unlikely to fight back, junior employees. People on temporary contracts, individuals without the resources to pursue legal action. And third, he was very good at corporate politics. Fletcher cultivated relationships with senior executives and built a reputation as an innovative thinker. When junior employees complained about stolen ideas, their concerns were dismissed as sour grapes or misunderstandings. I thought about my own experience with this dismissive attitude. How many times had I been told that ideas couldn't be owned, that innovation was collaborative, that I should be grateful for any recognition at all? Agent Morrison. What made Marcus finally make a mistake? She smiled grimly. You did. When he stole your ADAPT framework and used it to start his own company. He crossed several legal lines that made federal prosecution inevitable. Patent fraud, racketeering, wire fraud. He turned intellectual property theft into a federal crime spree. In the previous cases, those will be prosecuted as part of a larger pattern of racketeering. Your case provided the foundation, but the others show that Fletcher engaged in organized criminal activity over an extended period. As Agent Morrison packed up her files, I reflected on the strange turns my life had taken over the past 4 months. I had started with a simple goal, getting credit for my own work and preventing Marcus from profiting from his theft. Now I was at the center of a federal investigation that could reshape how intellectual property theft is prosecuted in corporate America. Ms. Martinez, Agent Morrison said as she prepared to leave, I want you to know that your courage in documenting and reporting this theft has probably saved dozens of careers. Fletcher's pattern suggests he would have continued stealing ideas indefinitely if you hadn't stopped him. That evening, I called my parents to update them on the case. They had been following the news coverage, but I wanted them to hear the latest developments directly from me. Mija, my mother said after I finished explaining the expanded investigation, I'm so proud of you for fighting back. Too many people would have just accepted the injustice and moved on. I almost did, I admitted. For about a week after Marcus rejected my promotion, I considered just finding another job and starting over somewhere else. What changed your mind? I thought about that question for a long moment. What had convinced me to fight rather than flee? I realized that running away wouldn't solve the problem, I said finally. Marcus would just steal from the next person. And the next, and the next. Someone had to break the pattern. And it turned out to be you, my father added with obvious pride. Your grandmother would have been proud. She always said that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. After ending the call, I sat in my living room thinking about the week ahead. Monday's interview would probably bring more attention, more scrutiny, and possibly more threats from Marcus's supporters. But it would also give me a platform to speak directly to other victims of intellectual property theft. To let them know they weren't alone and they didn't have to accept injustice. The hollow feeling I had experienced earlier was completely gone now. Replaced by a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal revenge. Marcus Fletcher had taught me something valuable. Though not intentionally, sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't getting even, it's making sure the same injustice can't happen to anyone else. Monday's interview with Channel 7 took place in the same studio as before, but the atmosphere felt completely different. Beverly Chin had prepared more extensive questions. And there were additional cameras to capture different angles. This wasn't just a local business story anymore, it was a national case study in corporate crime. Alex, Beverly began once we were recording, when you first discovered that Marcus Fletcher had stolen your ideas. Did you have any indication that this was part of a larger pattern? Not at all, I replied honestly. I thought I was dealing with an isolated case of workplace injustice. It wasn't until the federal investigation began that we discovered Marcus had been systematically stealing intellectual property throughout his entire career. What was your reaction when you learned about the other victims? I paused, remembering the moment Agent Morrison had shown me the evidence of Marcus's previous thefts. I felt sick, honestly. Realizing that dozens of people had gone through what I experienced, but without any recourse or justice, it was devastating. But also validating, in a way. Yes. In the sense that it confirmed my suspicions about Marcus's character. But it was horrifying to realize how many careers he had damaged over the years. Beverly leaned forward slightly. Your documentation was apparently crucial in helping investigators identify the pattern. Can you walk us through how you approached building your case? I explained my methodology, the timelines, the email archives, the careful cross-referencing of dates and claims. What I didn't mention was how obsessive it had become. How many sleepless nights I had spent organizing evidence and planning my approach. What advice would you give to other employees who suspect their ideas have been stolen? Document everything immediately, I said firmly. Don't wait for the theft to become obvious, start building your case the moment you suspect something is wrong. And don't assume you're the only victim. Intellectual property thieves rarely stop at one theft. The federal charges against Fletcher could result in decades in prison. How do you feel about that? This was the question I had been dreading, partly because I wasn't sure how I felt about Marcus's potential punishment. I feel that justice is being served, I said carefully. Marcus made choices that harmed dozens of people over many years. The consequences he's facing are the natural result of those choices. Any regrets about coming forward? None. The only regret I have is that it took so long for Marcus's pattern to be exposed. If I had spoken up sooner, maybe some of the later victims could have been spared. After the interview, Beverly walked me to the lobby again. Off the record, she said. The response to your story has been incredible. We've received dozens of calls from people reporting similar experiences with idea theft. Your case has given people permission to speak up. That afternoon, I returned to find my email inbox flooded with messages from across the country. Engineers, consultants, Designers, researchers, all sharing their own experiences with stolen intellectual property. Some were asking for advice on documentation. Others simply wanted to thank me for bringing attention to an issue they had experienced personally. One email particularly caught my attention. It was from Dr. Patricia Valdez, the researcher whose client retention algorithm had been stolen by Marcus years earlier. Alex, I wanted to thank you for your courage in exposing Marcus Fletcher's theft. When I saw your case in the news, I realized I wasn't alone in what I experienced. Your documentation gave me the template I needed to approach federal investigators with my own evidence. Because of your case, I'm finally getting credit for work I developed 6 years ago. More importantly, the company that profited from my stolen algorithm is being forced to provide proper attribution and compensation. You didn't just fight for your own justice, you fought for all of us. Thank you. Patricia, I read the email several times, feeling a complex mix of emotions. My battle with Marcus had started as a personal quest for recognition and justice. But it had evolved into something much larger, a catalyst for systemic change in how intellectual property theft is addressed in corporate America. Around 4 o'clock, Harrison Walsh called with another update. Alex, I just got off the phone with the federal prosecutor. Marcus Fletcher's legal team approached them about a plea agreement. What kind of plea? Full admission of guilt on all charges, cooperation with the ongoing investigation. An agreement to pay restitution to all identified victims. In exchange, they're asking for a reduced sentence recommendation. I felt a strange sense of anticlimax. After months of building evidence and fighting for justice, Marcus was simply going to admit guilt and accept punishment? It felt too easy, somehow. What do you think he'll get? Even with a plea agreement, probably 5 to 10 years in federal prison plus massive financial penalties. His cooperation might reduce the sentence slightly. But the evidence is so overwhelming that prosecutors don't need his help to convict him. And the other victims? They'll all be eligible for restitution. Plus any civil damages they choose to pursue. Patricia Valdez's case alone could result in millions in compensation for her stolen algorithm. That evening, I worked late in my office, reviewing the intellectual property protection protocols I had been developing. The system I was building would create multiple safeguards against idea theft, better documentation requirements, clearer attribution processes, and stronger legal protections for employees who reported intellectual property violations. It was satisfying work, but also sobering. For every Marcus Fletcher who got caught, how many others were still operating with impunity? How many brilliant ideas were being stolen at this very moment by managers who had learned to game the system? My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Amanda Hoffman. Alex, I'm still in the office and saw your light on. Can I come by for a minute? Amanda appeared in my doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression that suggested serious conversation. I wanted to talk to you about what happens next, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. Your case has made you something of a celebrity in intellectual property circles. There are going to be opportunities, speaking engagements, consulting offers. Book deals probably. I hadn't considered the possibility of leveraging my experience into a broader career opportunity. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you think carefully about what you want your legacy to be. You could parlay this into a lucrative consulting career, helping other companies protect their intellectual property. Or you could stay here and build the systems that prevent future theft. What would you do? Amanda smiled. I'd probably take the money and run. But then again, I'm not the person who spent 3 months building an airtight case against intellectual property theft while maintaining my regular job responsibilities. She had a point. The practical side of me recognized that my newfound expertise in intellectual property protection could be extremely valuable in the consulting market. But the idealistic side wanted to stay at Brennan and Associates and build something permanent. Something that would protect future employees from experiencing what I had been through. Amanda, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. If I hadn't documented everything so thoroughly. If I hadn't built such a strong case, would the company have supported me against Marcus? She was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. Honestly? Probably not. Marcus had too much political capital, too many connections. Without overwhelming evidence, it would have been your word against his. And he would have won. So justice only happened because I was obsessive about documentation? Justice happened because you refused to accept injustice. And you were smart enough to build an unbreakable case. That's not just documentation, that's intelligence, persistence, and courage. After Amanda left, I sat alone in my office thinking about legacy and justice and the strange turns life sometimes takes. 4 months ago, I had been a frustrated analyst with stolen ideas and blocked career prospects. Now I was at the center of a federal investigation that was reshaping intellectual property law. But the most important change wasn't professional, it was personal. I had learned that silence in the face of injustice doesn't protect anyone, it just enables more injustice. I had discovered that careful documentation and strategic thinking could overcome institutional bias in corporate politics. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that fighting back was not only possible but necessary. My computer chimed with a new email notification. The sender was Agent Morrison. And the subject line read, Fletcher plea agreement finalized. Ms. Martinez, Marcus Fletcher formally accepted a plea agreement this afternoon. He has admitted guilt to federal charges of intellectual property theft, patent fraud, and racketeering. The agreement includes full restitution to all identified victims in cooperation with our ongoing investigation. His sentencing hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from today. Given the scope of his crimes, he will likely receive 8 to 12 years in federal prison. I wanted you to know that your documentation was instrumental not just in prosecuting Fletcher, but in helping us develop new protocols for investigating intellectual property theft. Your case will be used as a training example for federal agents investigating similar crimes. Thank you for your courage in coming forward. Your actions have protected countless future victims. Special Agent Rachel Morrison. I read the email twice. Then leaned back in my chair and looked out at the city lights. It was over. Marcus Fletcher had admitted his guilt, accepted his punishment, and agreed to compensate his victims. Justice had been served, precedents had been set, and protections had been created for future victims. But as I gathered my things and prepared to head home, I realized that this wasn't really an ending, it was a beginning. The skills I had developed, the knowledge I had gained, the platform I had built, all of it could be used to fight similar injustices and protect other people's innovations. Marcus Fletcher had tried to steal my ideas and destroy my career. Instead, he had inadvertently launched my mission to protect intellectual property rights throughout corporate America. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's turning your pain into purpose and your struggle into strength. 6 weeks later, I stood outside the federal courthouse watching Marcus Fletcher disappear into a prison transport van. The sentencing hearing had taken most of the morning, with victim impact statements from 8 different people whose ideas he had stolen over the years. When my turn came to address the court, I had kept my statement brief and focused on the future rather than the past. Your Honor, Marcus Fletcher's theft of my intellectual property was devastating. But what we've learned about his pattern of theft is even more serious. I hope his sentence sends a clear message that intellectual property rights will be protected and that employees who report theft will be supported, not silenced. The judge had sentenced Marcus to 10 years in federal prison, along with restitution payments that would likely consume every asset he owned. Fletch Tech Solutions had been liquidated, its remaining assets distributed to creditors and victims. Marcus's career, his reputation, and his freedom were all forfeit, the natural consequences of a decade spent building success on stolen foundations. Harrison Walsh approached me as the crowd dispersed. How do you feel? He asked. I considered the question carefully. Satisfied, I said finally. Justice was served, the victims got compensation. And the system worked the way it's supposed to work when people stand up for what's right. Any regrets? Just one. I regret that it took so long for Marcus's pattern to be exposed. If someone had spoken up earlier, a lot of people could have been spared what they went through. That afternoon, I returned to Brennan and Associates to find a surprise waiting in my office. Amanda Hoffman was there with Jonathan Brennan and Patricia Santos, along with a small group of board members I recognized from my presentation months earlier. "Alex," Jonathan began, "we wanted to meet with you before the news becomes public. The board has voted to promote you to Director of Intellectual Property Protection, a new senior-level position that will oversee all aspects of innovation security across our company." I felt a surge of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you. That's unexpected." "It's well-deserved," Patricia added. "Your work over the past 6 months has not only resolved a serious theft issue but has also created new industry standards for protecting employee innovations. Other companies are already adopting the protocols you developed." Amanda handed me a folder containing my new job description and compensation package. The salary increase was substantial, but more importantly, the position would give me the authority and resources to implement comprehensive intellectual property protections throughout the company. "There's one more thing," Jonathan continued. "The board has also approved funding for you to speak at industry conferences and potentially write a book about your experience. We think your story needs to be shared widely to help other companies avoid similar problems." After the board members left, I sat alone in my office processing this latest development. In 8 months, I had gone from a blocked analyst to a director-level executive with a national platform for advocating intellectual property rights. The transformation was almost surreal. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Beverly Chin from Channel 7. "Alex, I know you're probably tired of interviews, but I wanted to let you know about something interesting. Since your story first aired, we've received reports of intellectual property theft cases at 12 different companies in the area. Your willingness to speak publicly has encouraged a lot of people to come forward." "That's incredible," I said. "And encouraging. It gets better. 3 companies have already implemented new IP protection policies based on the protocols you developed. You've started a movement, Alex." After ending the call, I walked to the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, employees were developing innovative ideas that could change industries, solve problems, and advance human knowledge. Some of those employees would see their ideas stolen by unethical managers who prioritized personal advancement over ethical behavior. But now, thanks to the precedent set by Marcus Fletcher's case, those employees would have better protections, clearer documentation requirements, and stronger legal recourse. They would know that intellectual property theft was a serious crime with serious consequences, not just an unfortunate reality of corporate life. My computer chimed with an email notification. The sender was Dr. Patricia Valdez, the researcher whose stolen algorithm had been part of the federal case against Marcus. "Alex, I wanted to update you on my situation. The company that profited from my stolen algorithm has agreed to a settlement that includes full attribution for my work, substantial financial compensation, and a commitment to implement stronger IP protection policies. More importantly, they've offered me a senior research position with guaranteed intellectual property protections for all my future work. It's the job I should have had 6 years ago, when my algorithm was first stolen. None of this would have happened without your courage in exposing Marcus Fletcher's theft. You didn't just save your own career, you helped restore mine and protected countless others. I'm planning to focus my research on developing better systems for protecting intellectual property in academic and corporate settings. Would you be interested in collaborating on some projects? I think our combined experience could lead to some innovative solutions. With gratitude and admiration." Patricia. I read the email twice, then composed a response accepting her offer to collaborate. The idea of working with other theft victims to develop better protection systems was appealing, both professionally and personally. As I prepared to leave the office, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 9 months ago, I had been an overlooked analyst with innovative ideas and blocked career prospects. Marcus Fletcher had seemed untouchable, protected by corporate hierarchy and political connections. But I had learned something important: careful documentation, strategic thinking, and persistent effort could overcome even the most entrenched injustice. More importantly, I had discovered that fighting back wasn't just about personal vindication, it was about changing systems that allowed injustice to flourish. The elevator ride to the parking garage gave me time to think about the future. My new position would allow me to build comprehensive protections for intellectual property throughout Brennan and Associates. The speaking engagements and potential book would give me a platform to advocate for similar protections throughout the industry. But perhaps most importantly, I would be able to ensure that no other employee at our company would experience what I had been through. No one would have their ideas stolen, their career blocked, or their innovations appropriated by unethical managers. As I drove home through the evening traffic, I thought about Marcus Fletcher beginning his first night in federal prison. His decade-long pattern of theft had finally caught up with him, destroying everything he had built on stolen foundations. Justice had been served, precedents had been set, and protections had been created. But this wasn't really about Marcus Fletcher anymore. It was about building a future where intellectual property rights were protected, where innovation was properly attributed, and where employees could develop breakthrough ideas without fear of theft. Marcus had tried to steal my future. Instead, he had inadvertently helped me build a better one, not just for myself, but for everyone who would come after me. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying your enemy, it's using their attack to become stronger, smarter, and more determined to protect others from the same injustice. The victory was complete, but the work was just beginning. 3 months after Marcus Fletcher's sentencing, I was standing on a stage at the National Intellectual Property Conference in Chicago, looking out at an audience of 500 attorneys, executives, and researchers. The title of my presentation was From Theft to Justice: Building Comprehensive IP Protection in Corporate Environments. Intellectual property theft doesn't happen in a vacuum, I began, clicking to my first slide. It thrives in environments where documentation is poor, attribution is unclear, and employees fear retaliation for reporting violations. The audience was attentive, taking notes and occasionally nodding in recognition. Many of them had probably encountered intellectual property theft in their own organizations, either as victims or as investigators trying to sort out competing claims after the fact. The Marcus Fletcher case demonstrates that systematic IP theft can operate for years without detection. But it also shows that comprehensive documentation and strategic legal action can expose even the most sophisticated theft operations. I clicked through slides showing the timeline of Marcus's theft, the federal investigation that followed, and the new protection protocols that had emerged from the case. The presentation had been refined through dozens of similar conferences over the past 3 months. But the core message remained the same: intellectual property theft was preventable, but only through systematic documentation and institutional commitment to protecting employee innovations. The key lesson from this case, I concluded, is that silence enables theft, while documentation and courage enable justice. Every organization needs clear policies, consistent enforcement, and cultural commitment to protecting the intellectual property rights of their employees. During the question and answer session, a patent attorney from Boston raised her hand. Ms. Martinez, your case resulted in criminal prosecution, which is relatively rare for intellectual property theft. What factors made federal prosecution possible? 3 things, I replied. First, the systematic nature of Marcus Fletcher's theft across multiple companies made it a racketeering case rather than isolated incidents. Second, his patent fraud claims elevated it to federal jurisdiction. Third, and most importantly, comprehensive documentation made the case impossible to dispute or dismiss. A corporate executive from Seattle asked the follow-up question I had been expecting. What advice would you give to employees who suspect their ideas have been stolen but don't have the kind of documentation you maintained? Start documenting immediately, I said firmly. Don't wait for perfect evidence, begin building your case the moment you suspect theft. Email yourself timestamped summaries of meetings, keep copies of all your work, and maintain detailed records of who had access to your ideas and when. But what if the theft has already occurred? Then focus on preventing future theft while building whatever evidence you can about past incidents. IP thieves rarely stop at one theft. If you've been victimized once, there are probably other victims who can corroborate the pattern. After the presentation, I was approached by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a research scientist from a major pharmaceutical company. Ms. Martinez, I've been following your case since it first made headlines. I'm dealing with a similar situation, and I was hoping you might have some specific advice. We found a quiet corner of the conference center where she could speak privately. My research director has been taking credit for drug compounds I developed, presenting them as his own work to our board of directors. I have documentation, but I'm afraid that speaking up will destroy my career. What kind of documentation? I asked. Lab notebooks, email communications, even video recordings of me presenting the compounds to our research team. Everything is timestamped and witnessed. That's excellent evidence. Have you consulted with an attorney? Not yet. I wasn't sure if I had enough proof. And I'm worried about retaliation. I gave her Harrison Walsh's contact information and spent 20 minutes walking her through the documentation strategy that had been so effective in my case. By the time we finished talking, she seemed more confident about her options and more determined to fight back. You know, she said as we prepared to rejoin the conference, 6 months ago I would have just accepted this and looked for another job. Your case showed me that theft doesn't have to be tolerated. Similar conversations occurred throughout the conference. Researchers, engineers, consultants, and designers all shared their experiences with idea theft, many for the first time. My case had given them a vocabulary for describing their experiences and a framework for addressing them systematically. The flight back to my home city gave me time to process the impact my story was having across the country. In the 9 months since Marcus Fletcher's arrest, I had spoken at 12 conferences, consulted with dozens of companies on intellectual property protection, and helped more than 50 individual victims document and report theft cases. The book project was moving forward as well. Stolen Ideas: How to Protect Your Intellectual Property in Corporate America was scheduled for publication in 6 months, with advance orders already exceeding expectations. The publisher was planning a national book tour that would give me an even larger platform for advocating IP protection rights. But perhaps most satisfying was the work I was doing at Brennan & Associates. The intellectual property protection protocols I had developed were now being licensed to other companies, creating industry-wide standards for preventing and addressing idea theft. We had successfully prevented 3 potential theft cases in the past quarter alone, catching them early through improved documentation and reporting systems. When I arrived at the office Monday morning, Amanda Hoffman was waiting with updates that exceeded even my ambitious expectations. Alex, I have 3 pieces of news that I think you'll find interesting. First, the Department of Justice has invited you to participate in a task force on intellectual property crime. They want to use your experience to develop new prosecution guidelines. I felt a surge of excitement mixed with responsibility. What would that involve? Consulting with federal prosecutors on IP theft cases, helping develop training materials for investigators, and possibly testifying before Congress about the need for stronger protections. What's the second piece of news? Harvard Business School wants to create a case study based on your experience with Marcus Fletcher. They think it would be valuable for teaching business ethics and intellectual property law. The idea of my experience being used to educate future business leaders was appealing. And the third thing? Amanda smiled. Time magazine wants to interview you for their annual People Who Mattered issue. Apparently, Your case has influenced intellectual property policy at both the corporate and federal level. I sat down heavily in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what had grown from my initial desire for justice in a single workplace dispute. Amanda, this is getting bigger than I ever imagined. That's what happens when you refuse to accept injustice and you're smart enough to document everything systematically. Your case didn't just expose Marcus Fletcher, it exposed a systemic problem that needed to be addressed. That afternoon, I received a call that brought the Marcus Fletcher chapter of this story to a definitive close. Agent Morrison was calling with a final update on the federal investigation. Alex, I wanted you to know that Marcus Fletcher's cooperation with our investigation has led to additional prosecutions at 2 other companies. His testimony helped us identify and prosecute 3 other executives who were engaged in systematic intellectual property theft. How is he adjusting to prison? As well as can be expected for someone who went from corner office to federal penitentiary. He's working in the prison library, actually, helping other inmates with their legal appeals. Ironic, considering why he's there. Any word on the restitution payments? All victims have been fully compensated, plus interest and penalties. The civil asset forfeiture process recovered enough from Fletcher's assets to cover everything, with some funds left over for a victim assistance program. After Agent Morrison hung up, I sat in my office reflecting on the complete arc of justice that had played out over the past year. Marcus Fletcher was serving his sentence. His victims had been compensated, new protections had been created, and the precedent had been set for future prosecutions. But more importantly, the culture around intellectual property theft was changing. Companies were implementing stronger protections, employees were more aware of their rights, and prosecutors were taking IP theft cases more seriously. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Patricia Valdez, who had become a close colleague in our collaborative work on IP protection systems. Alex, saw the Time magazine announcement online. Well deserved. Our joint research paper on predictive IP theft detection has been accepted by the Harvard Business Review. Your case continues to generate positive change. I typed back, incredible news. Who would have thought that documenting workplace injustice could lead to academic publication? Her response came quickly, you turned personal pain into professional purpose. That's the definition of transforming adversity into advantage. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I took a moment to look around my new space. The corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows was a far cry from the windowless cubicle where I had started this journey. But the real change wasn't in my physical environment, it was in my understanding of what was possible when someone refused to accept injustice. The elevator ride to the parking garage gave me time to think about the future. The Department of Justice Task Force would give me influence over federal IP protection policy. The Harvard case study would help educate future business leaders about ethical innovation practices. The Time magazine interview would provide a national platform for advocating employee rights. But perhaps most importantly, the hundreds of individual conversations I'd had with theft victims over the past year were creating a network of advocates who would continue this work long after my story faded from the headlines. My phone rang as I reached my car. The caller ID showed Harrison Walsh. Alex, I just wanted to check in and see how you're processing all this attention. A year ago, you were an overlooked analyst. Now you're testifying before Congress and being featured in national magazines. It's surreal, I admitted. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life. Any regrets about not taking one of those lucrative consulting offers and capitalizing on your fame? I considered the question as I started my car and pulled out of the parking garage. No regrets. The money would have been nice, but this work feels more important. Every person I help protect from IP theft makes the whole experience worthwhile. You sound like someone who's found their calling. I think I have. Marcus Fletcher tried to steal my future, but he inadvertently helped me discover my purpose. I'm not sure I would have found this path any other way. The drive home took me past the building where Fletch Tech Solutions had once operated. The space was now occupied by a small nonprofit that provided legal assistance to employees dealing with workplace violations. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus's stolen empire had been replaced by an organization dedicated to protecting the very people he had victimized. As I pulled into my driveway, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 12 months ago, I had been planning revenge against a boss who had stolen my ideas and blocked my career. Tonight, I was planning testimony for a congressional hearing on intellectual property rights and preparing for a book tour that would take me across the country. Marcus Fletcher was serving his sentence in federal prison, probably lying on a narrow bunk in a small cell, contemplating the decade of choices that had led him there. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, his freedom forfeit. But this wasn't really about Marcus Fletcher anymore. It was about building systems that would protect future innovators from experiencing what I had been through. It was about changing corporate culture to value ethical innovation over stolen success. It was about ensuring that intellectual property rights were protected at every level of American business. The best revenge, I had learned, wasn't destroying your enemy. It was taking their attack and using it to build something better, stronger, and more just than what existed before. Marcus had tried to steal my ideas and destroy my career. Instead, he had launched my mission to protect intellectual property rights throughout corporate America. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation. 1 year after Marcus Fletcher's sentencing, I stood in the Russell Senate office building preparing to testify before the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Intellectual Property. The hearing was titled Protecting Innovation, Strengthening IP Rights in Corporate America, and my testimony would be used to draft new federal legislation on intellectual property theft. Senator Patricia Williams, the subcommittee chair, had personally invited me to testify after reading about my case in Time magazine. Ms. Martinez, she had said during our preparatory call, your experience demonstrates both the scope of IP theft in corporate America and the potential for systematic solutions. We need your expertise to craft legislation that actually protects innovators. As I reviewed my prepared remarks one final time, I thought about how far this journey had taken me from that conference room where Marcus Fletcher had dismissed my promotion request. In 18 months, I had gone from theft victim to national advocate, from blocked analyst to congressional witness. Senators, I began when called to testify. Intellectual property theft in corporate environments is not just a legal issue, it's a systemic problem that undermines innovation, destroys careers, and weakens American competitiveness. I outlined the scope of the problem, drawing on data from the hundreds of cases I had investigated or consulted on since my story became public. Conservative estimates suggest that IP theft affects more than 100,000 American workers annually, with economic losses exceeding $50 billion per year. Ms. Martinez, Senator Williams interrupted, what factors enable this level of theft to occur? 3 primary factors, Senator. First, inadequate documentation requirements that make theft difficult to prove. Second, insufficient legal protections for employees who report IP violations. Third, corporate cultures that prioritize results over ethics, allowing successful thieves to advance while their victims are silenced. I spent 20 minutes walking the subcommittee through the Marcus Fletcher case, highlighting the systematic nature of his theft and the federal investigation that resulted. Senator, this case demonstrates that IP theft is often not isolated incidents but organized criminal activity that can operate for years without detection. Senator James Morrison from Texas leaned forward. Ms. Martinez, what specific legislative changes would you recommend to address these problems? 4 key areas, Senator. First, mandatory IP documentation standards for companies above a certain size. Second, whistleblower protections specifically for IP theft reporting. Third, enhanced federal penalties that treat systematic IP theft as racketeering. Fourth, victim compensation programs funded by civil asset forfeiture from convicted thieves. The questioning continued for another hour. with senators from both parties asking detailed questions about implementation, enforcement, and potential unintended consequences. Their engagement was encouraging. This wasn't just political theater but serious legislative inquiry. After the hearing, I was approached by Senator Williams in the hallway. "Ms. Martinez, your testimony was exactly what we needed to move forward with comprehensive IP protection legislation. Would you be available to consult with our drafting team over the next few months?" "Absolutely, Senator. This issue is too important to leave to chance." The flight back home gave me time to process the surreal experience of testifying before Congress about issues that had started with my personal workplace injustice. The proposed legislation, tentatively called the Innovation Protection Act, would create the first comprehensive federal framework for preventing and prosecuting intellectual property theft in corporate environments. When I arrived at the office the next morning, Amanda Hoffman was waiting with news that would add another dimension to my expanding platform. "Alex, I just got off the phone with the producer of 60 Minutes. They want to do a segment on intellectual property theft, using your case as the centerpiece. It would air during their season premiere, reaching about 15 million viewers." I felt the familiar mix of excitement and apprehension that accompanied each new opportunity to share my story. What would they want to cover? The Marcus Fletcher case, obviously, but also the broader impact your advocacy has had on IP protection nationwide. They want to interview some of the other victims you've helped, show how your documentation methods have been adopted by other companies, and discuss the congressional legislation you just testified about. Any downside? National television exposure always carries risks. But 60 Minutes has a reputation for serious journalism. They're not looking for sensationalism, they want to examine IP theft as a serious economic and legal issue. I agreed to the interview, recognizing that 15 million viewers represented the largest platform I had ever been offered to advocate for intellectual property rights. That afternoon, I received a call that brought the Marcus Fletcher story full circle in an unexpected way. The caller was Jake Martinez, no relation. Despite the shared last name, a former Fletch Tech employee who had been working there during the company's collapse. "Ms. Martinez, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Agent Morrison, who said you might be interested in what I have to share." "What kind of information?" I was Marcus Fletcher's assistant during the final months of Fletch Tech. I kept detailed records of his activities, including some things that never came out during the federal investigation. "What kind of things?" "Evidence that he was planning to steal additional intellectual property from other companies, including detailed files on employees he was targeting for recruitment. I think he was building a systematic operation for corporate espionage." I arranged to meet with Jake the following day, bringing Harrison Walsh along for legal guidance. What Jake showed us was disturbing: folders containing detailed research on dozens of innovators at competing companies, along with strategies for recruiting them and appropriating their ideas. Marcus had been planning to expand his theft operation, Jake explained, spreading documents across the conference room table. He wasn't just stealing from his own employees, he was targeting innovators throughout the industry. Harrison examined the documents carefully. "This is evidence of conspiracy to commit intellectual property theft on an industrial scale. Why didn't this come out during the federal investigation?" "I was scared," Jake admitted. "I thought cooperating with the investigation would be enough. But seeing Ms. Martinez's work helping other victims made me realize I had an obligation to share everything I knew." We immediately contacted Agent Morrison, who arranged for Jake to provide formal testimony about Marcus's expanded theft plans. The new evidence would likely result in additional charges and a longer sentence. But more importantly, it provided insights into how systematic IP theft operations could be identified and prevented. As we concluded the meeting, Jake had a question that caught me off guard. "Ms. Martinez, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't fought back? If you had just accepted the theft and moved on?" I considered his question carefully. I think Marcus would have continued stealing ideas until someone else finally stopped him. But dozens more people would have been victimized in the meantime. Do you think your case will actually prevent similar theft from happening elsewhere? I hope so. But prevention requires constant vigilance. There will always be people like Marcus who think they can build success on other people's work. The key is creating systems that make theft more difficult and consequences more certain. That evening, I worked late in my office, reviewing the manuscript for my book, which was due to the publisher in 2 weeks. The final chapter focused on the transformation of pain into purpose, examining how victims of intellectual property theft could channel their experience into advocacy for systemic change. The goal, I had written, is not just to recover from intellectual property theft, but to ensure that future innovators are protected from experiencing the same injustice. Every documented case, every successful prosecution, every policy change represents progress toward a more ethical innovation environment. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Patricia Valdez. Saw the congressional hearing coverage. You were brilliant. Our joint research on predictive IP theft detection is being implemented by 3 major corporations this quarter. I typed back, amazing progress. Marcus Fletcher inadvertently created a movement that's protecting innovators nationwide. Her response, the best revenge is building something better than what your enemy tried to destroy. As I prepared to leave the office, I reflected on the profound changes that had occurred in my life over the past 2 years. Marcus Fletcher's theft of my ideas had been devastating at the time, but it had also catalyzed discoveries about my own capabilities that I might never have made otherwise. I had learned that careful documentation could overcome institutional bias, that strategic thinking could defeat political connections, and that persistence could triumph over injustice. More importantly, I had discovered that personal pain could be transformed into professional purpose if channeled correctly. The elevator ride to the parking garage gave me time to think about the future. The congressional legislation I had helped shape would create new protections for millions of American workers. The book tour would give me opportunities to advocate for IP rights in dozens of cities. The 60 Minutes segment would reach audiences I could never access through conferences or academic papers. But perhaps most satisfying was the knowledge that hundreds of intellectual property theft cases had been successfully resolved using the documentation and advocacy methods I had developed. Each victory represented another innovator whose ideas were protected, another career that was preserved, another instance where justice prevailed over theft. My phone rang as I reached my car. The caller ID showed Harrison Walsh. Alex, I just heard from Agent Morrison about the additional evidence Jake provided. Marcus Fletcher is looking at an additional 5 years in prison for conspiracy charges. How is he taking the news? Not well, apparently. His lawyers are trying to negotiate another plea agreement, but the prosecutors aren't interested. He's already admitted to systematic theft. Adding conspiracy charges is just the logical extension of what he was already doing. Any regrets about how this all played out? I considered the question as I started my car and pulled out of the parking garage. 2 years ago, if someone had told me that my promotion denial would lead to a federal investigation, congressional testimony, and a national platform for advocacy, I would have thought they were delusional. No regrets, I said finally. Marcus Fletcher tried to steal my future. Instead, he helped me discover a calling I never knew I had. Sometimes the biggest betrayals lead to the most important breakthroughs. You sound like someone who's found peace with what happened. I have. Not because I'm satisfied with revenge, but because I'm satisfied with justice. Marcus is paying for his crimes, his victims have been compensated, and systems have been created to prevent future theft. That's as close to complete justice as anyone could reasonably expect. The drive home took me past the university where I had studied business, the consulting firm where I had started my career, and the building where Fletch Tech Solutions had briefly operated before collapsing under the weight of its stolen foundations. Each location represented a different phase of my journey from victim to advocate, from powerless employee to national expert on intellectual property protection. The path had been longer and more complex than I had ever imagined, but it had led to outcomes that exceeded my wildest hopes for justice and recognition. As I pulled into my driveway, I thought about Marcus Fletcher beginning his second year in federal prison. He had probably spent countless hours reflecting on the choices that led him there, wondering if the temporary success was worth the permanent consequences. But this story wasn't really about Marcus Fletcher anymore. It was about the transformation of injustice into advocacy, the conversion of personal pain into professional purpose. And the discovery that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is not revenge but the determination to ensure that no one else experiences the same injustice. The best victories, I had learned, weren't about destroying your enemies. They were about building something better, stronger, and more just than what existed before the conflict began. 2 years after the congressional hearing, I was standing in the green room of Good Morning America preparing for what would be my final major television interview about the Marcus Fletcher case. My book had topped bestseller lists for 6 consecutive weeks, the Innovation Protection Act had become federal law, and intellectual property theft prosecutions had increased by 300% nationwide. Ms. Martinez, the producer said, "We'll be discussing the long-term impact of your case and the new federal legislation it inspired. The host will probably ask about your transition from victim to national advocate." As I waited for my segment, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years ago, I had been an unknown analyst struggling for recognition in a corporate environment that seemed designed to overlook innovation unless it came from the right people at the right level. Now I was the director of the National Intellectual Property Protection Institute, a position created by Congress as part of the Innovation Protection Act. My job was to coordinate federal, state, and corporate efforts to prevent and prosecute intellectual property theft, working with everyone from FBI agents to startup founders. Ms. Martinez, you're on in 30 seconds, the floor manager announced. The interview covered familiar ground, the Marcus Fletcher case, the federal investigation, the congressional testimony, and the resulting legislation. But the host, Maria Santos, asked one question that caught me off guard. "Alex, 3 years ago you were a mid-level analyst whose promotion was denied. Today you're testifying before Congress and directing national policy on intellectual property rights. If you could go back and prevent Marcus Fletcher from stealing your ideas, would you?" I paused, considering the implications of her question. "Maria, that's fascinating to think about. If Marcus hadn't stolen my ideas, I probably would have gotten my promotion, continued working as a senior analyst, and never discovered this calling. His theft was devastating at the time, but it led to outcomes I never could have achieved otherwise." "So you're saying his crime inadvertently launched your career?" "I'm saying his crime revealed capabilities I didn't know I possessed. The skills I developed fighting his theft, systematic documentation, strategic thinking, persistent advocacy, those became the foundation for everything that followed." After the interview, I took a taxi to the airport for my flight back to Washington. The past month had been a whirlwind of book tour appearances, conference speeches, and policy meetings. But I was looking forward to returning to the more substantive work of building intellectual property protections. During the flight, I reviewed my schedule for the coming week. Monday was a meeting with Department of Justice officials about expanding IP theft prosecution guidelines. Tuesday was a conference call with corporate executives implementing new protection protocols. Wednesday was testimony before a House subcommittee about funding for IP protection enforcement. But the most important meeting was Thursday, a gathering of intellectual property theft victims who had successfully used my documentation methods to seek justice in their own cases. Over the past 3 years, more than 500 people had contacted me for advice on fighting IP theft, and 127 had achieved successful outcomes including criminal prosecutions, civil settlements, and policy changes at their companies. The Thursday meeting would be the first time many of these advocates had gathered in person. We were planning to establish a formal network for sharing resources, coordinating advocacy efforts, and supporting future victims of intellectual property theft. When I arrived at the office Monday morning, my assistant handed me a letter that had been marked personal and confidential. The return address showed the federal correctional institution where Marcus Fletcher was serving his sentence. I hesitated before opening it, unsure whether I wanted to maintain any communication with the person whose theft had changed my life so dramatically. But curiosity won, and I carefully opened the envelope. Ms. Martinez, I hope this letter finds you well. I have been following your advocacy work through news coverage, and I wanted you to know that I am genuinely impressed by what you have accomplished. I also wanted to apologize, formally and without reservation, for stealing your intellectual property and attempting to destroy your career. What I did was criminal, unethical, and inexcusable. No explanation or rationalization could justify the harm I caused to you and others. I understand that my apology cannot undo the damage I caused, but I hope it provides some measure of closure. I also want you to know that I have been working with federal investigators to help identify and prosecute other cases of systematic intellectual property theft. It is the least I can do to atone for my actions. I expect to be released from federal prison in 6 years. When that time comes, I plan to dedicate my remaining career to helping protect intellectual property rights. I know that my past actions make me an unlikely advocate for ethical innovation, but perhaps my experience as a perpetrator can provide unique insights into prevention strategies. I wish you continued success in your important work. Sincerely, Marcus Fletcher. I read the letter twice, trying to process the complex emotions it generated. Marcus's apology seemed genuine, and his offer to help protect intellectual property rights was unexpected. But I wasn't sure how to respond, or whether I should respond at all. I called Harrison Walsh for advice. Harrison, what do you think about Marcus Fletcher attempting to become an advocate for IP protection after his release? It's not unprecedented, he replied. Some of the most effective advocates against white-collar crime are former perpetrators who understand how the systems work from the inside. But it would take years of demonstrated commitment before anyone would trust him. Should I respond to his letter? That's entirely up to you. You have no obligation to maintain any relationship with him. But if you think his insights could be valuable for prevention efforts, it might be worth considering. I decided to show the letter to Dr. Patricia Valdez, who had become both a close colleague and trusted friend over the past 3 years. We were meeting for lunch to discuss our latest research paper on predictive indicators of intellectual property theft. Patricia, what do you think about the possibility of former perpetrators becoming advocates for IP protection? She considered the question while reviewing Marcus's letter. From a research perspective, his insights could be valuable. He understands the mindset, the methods, and the institutional vulnerabilities that enable systematic theft. From a personal perspective, I think forgiveness is often more healing for the victim than for the perpetrator. Do you think I should respond? I think you should do whatever feels right for your own peace of mind. You've already achieved everything you could reasonably want from this situation: justice, recognition, career advancement, and systemic change. Anything beyond that is personal choice, not obligation. That evening, I drafted a brief response to Marcus's letter. Mr. Fletcher, I received your letter and appreciate your apology. I also appreciate your cooperation with federal investigators in identifying other cases of intellectual property theft. If you are serious about dedicating your post-release career to protecting IP rights, I would encourage you to begin by educating yourself about the current state of protection efforts. The field has evolved significantly since your conviction. I wish you success in your rehabilitation and hope that your future actions will help repair the damage caused by your past choices. Sincerely, Alex Martinez. The response felt appropriate, acknowledging his apology without committing to any future relationship, and encouraging genuine rehabilitation while maintaining professional distance. Thursday's gathering of IP theft advocates exceeded my expectations. 43 people attended. representing cases from across the country and spanning multiple industries. Engineers, researchers, designers, consultants, and academics, all united by the experience of having their intellectual property stolen and their determination to prevent similar theft from affecting others. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the pharmaceutical researcher I had met at the Chicago conference, had successfully prosecuted her research director for systematic theft and was now leading IP protection efforts at her company. Jake Martinez, Marcus Fletcher's former assistant, had become a federal investigator specializing in corporate espionage cases. Alex, Elena said during a break in our discussions, "I've been thinking about the broader impact of your case. You didn't just expose one theft operation, you created a model for systematic resistance to IP theft that has been replicated hundreds of times." "What do you mean?" "I mean that your documentation methods, your advocacy strategies, your legal approaches, they've become the standard template for fighting intellectual property theft. Every case I've worked on has used techniques you pioneered." Jake nodded in agreement. The federal training program for IP theft investigations is based largely on your case. Agents learn to look for the same patterns you identified, use the same documentation standards you established, and apply the same strategic thinking you demonstrated. As our meeting concluded, we formally established the National Network of Intellectual Property Advocates, with a mission to support victims, share resources, and coordinate policy advocacy efforts. I was elected as the first president, but the organization was designed to be collaborative rather than hierarchical. Our goal, I said in my closing remarks, is to ensure that intellectual property theft becomes not just difficult to commit, but impossible to sustain. Every successful prosecution, every policy change, every cultural shift toward ethical innovation brings us closer to that goal. The taxi ride back to my hotel gave me time to reflect on the remarkable transformation that had occurred over the past 4 years. What had started as a personal quest for justice had evolved into a national movement for intellectual property protection, with hundreds of advocates working towards systemic change. Marcus Fletcher's theft had been devastating at the time, but it had also revealed possibilities I never could have imagined. The skills I developed fighting his theft, documentation, analysis, advocacy, strategic thinking, had become the foundation for a career that was more meaningful and impactful than anything I had previously envisioned. My phone buzzed with a text message from Amanda Hoffman, who is now the CEO of Brennan & Associates, saw the Good Morning America interview. "Proud to have played a small role in your journey from analyst to national advocate." I typed back, "You played a crucial role. Your support in that first board meeting changed everything." Her response, "You changed everything. We just had the wisdom to recognize it." As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the strange alchemy that had transformed injustice into justice, theft into advocacy, and personal pain into professional purpose. Marcus Fletcher had tried to steal my future, but he had inadvertently launched a calling that exceeded my wildest ambitions. The best revenge, I had learned, wasn't destroying your enemy. It was taking their attack and using it to build something better, stronger, and more protective than what existed before. Sometimes the greatest victories emerge from the deepest betrayals, if you have the courage to fight back and the wisdom to transform pain into purpose. 5 years after Marcus Fletcher's sentencing, I received a phone call that would bring the story full circle in a way I never could have anticipated. The caller was Dr. Michael Chen, the warden at the Federal Correctional Institution where Marcus was serving his sentence. "Ms. Martinez, I'm calling about Marcus Fletcher. I understand you've had some correspondence with him over the past few years. Marcus and I had exchanged perhaps a dozen letters during his incarceration, mostly focused on his research into intellectual property protection methods and his preparations for eventual release. His insights into theft methodologies had actually proven valuable for developing prevention strategies. What can I help you with, Dr. Chen?" "Mr. Fletcher has been working on an extensive research project about intellectual property theft prevention during his incarceration. He's compiled case studies, developed new detection methods, and created training materials that federal investigators say are remarkably sophisticated. I was intrigued despite myself. What kind of training materials? Materials that teach investigators how to think like intellectual property thieves in order to prevent and detect theft more effectively. The FBI has been consulting with him on several ongoing cases, and they say his insights have been extremely valuable. Dr. Chen paused before continuing. Mr. Fletcher is eligible for supervised release in 18 months. He's requested permission to donate his research to your institute as part of his transition back into society. I wanted to get your opinion on whether such a donation would be appropriate. I asked Dr. Chen to send me copies of Marcus's research materials so I could evaluate their quality and potential value. What arrived 2 weeks later was extraordinary, more than 500 pages of meticulously documented analysis of intellectual property theft methods, prevention strategies, and detection techniques. The research was organized around the same systematic approach Marcus had used for theft, but inverted toward protection. He had identified dozens of vulnerabilities in corporate IP protection systems and developed corresponding safeguards. More importantly, he had created training materials that would help investigators understand the psychology and methodology of systematic theft. I spent 3 days reviewing the materials before calling Dr. Chen back. The research is excellent, I told him. It's some of the most sophisticated analysis of IP theft prevention I've encountered. But I need to discuss this with my board before making any decisions about accepting the donation. The Board of Directors of the National Intellectual Property Protection Institute included several former victims of Marcus's theft, along with federal prosecutors, corporate executives, and academic researchers. Their reaction to Marcus's proposed donation was mixed. This could be extremely valuable for our prevention efforts, said Agent Morrison, who had joined the board after retiring from federal service. Fletcher's insights into theft methodologies could help us identify vulnerabilities we might never discover otherwise. Dr. Patricia Valdez was more cautious. I appreciate that he's trying to make amends, but we need to be careful about legitimizing his expertise. We don't want to create a situation where intellectual property thieves see crime as a pathway to consulting careers. Harrison Walsh, now serving as the Institute's legal counsel, raised practical concerns. If we accept the donation, we need clear policies about how the materials will be used and credited. We can't allow Fletcher to use this donation to rebuild his professional reputation without acknowledging the harm he caused. After extensive discussion, the board voted to accept Marcus's research donation with specific conditions. The materials would be credited to federal prisoner Marcus Fletcher, convicted of intellectual property theft, and any publications or training programs based on his research would include prominent disclaimers about his criminal background. Marcus's response to these conditions was unexpectedly gracious. Ms. Martinez, I accept the board's conditions without reservation. My goal is not to rehabilitate my reputation but to contribute something meaningful to the protection of intellectual property rights. If my research helps prevent even one person from experiencing what I put you and others through, the effort will have been worthwhile. I understand that my criminal background will always be part of my identity, and I accept that reality. But I hope that over time, my commitment to protecting IP rights will become equally part of who I am. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to contribute to prevention efforts. Sincerely, Marcus Fletcher. 6 months later, I found myself in an unusual situation, collaborating with the person who had stolen my ideas to develop training materials for preventing intellectual property theft. Our collaboration was conducted entirely through written correspondence and conference calls, with clear boundaries about the nature of our professional relationship. Marcus's insights proved invaluable for creating realistic training scenarios. He could predict how thieves would attempt to circumvent various protection measures, identify vulnerabilities in documentation systems, and explain the psychological factors that enabled systematic theft to continue undetected. The key, he explained during one of our calls, is understanding that intellectual property thieves don't see themselves as criminals. They rationalize their actions as collaboration, inspiration, or simply taking advantage of opportunities that present themselves. How do we counter that rationalization? By making the theft obvious and undeniable. Clear attribution requirements, comprehensive documentation, and immediate consequences for violations. Most thieves stop when the risks become too high and the benefits too uncertain. Our collaboration resulted in a comprehensive training program that was adopted by federal law enforcement agencies, corporate security departments, and academic institutions across the country. The program's effectiveness was demonstrated within its first year. Intellectual property theft detection rates increased by 40%, and successful prosecutions rose by 60%. But the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Rodriguez called me 6 months after the training program launched. "Alex, I need to tell you something remarkable. We just prevented a major IP theft at my company using the detection methods from your training program. A senior researcher was systematically stealing drug compound formulas and planning to sell them to competitors. How did you catch him? The early warning indicators your program identified: unusual access patterns, suspicious file transfers, inconsistent attribution claims. Once we knew what to look for, the pattern was obvious. Were you able to prosecute? Full criminal prosecution, plus civil recovery of all stolen materials. But here's the interesting part: the detection methods that caught him were originally developed by Marcus Fletcher during his incarceration research. The irony was profound. Marcus's expertise in intellectual property theft, refined during his years in federal prison, had become one of our most effective tools for preventing similar crimes. His deep understanding of theft methodologies, when properly channeled, provided insights that conventional security experts couldn't match. 18 months later, I received another call from Dr. Chen at the Federal Correctional Institution. "Ms. Martinez, Marcus Fletcher is being released next week under supervised probation. He's requested a meeting with you to discuss his transition plans. But only if you're comfortable with such a meeting." I had been dreading and anticipating this moment for months. Marcus had become a valuable collaborator in our prevention efforts, but he was also the person who had nearly destroyed my career 5 years earlier. Meeting him face-to-face would require confronting complex emotions about forgiveness, redemption, and the strange relationship we had developed. After consulting with Dr. Valdez and Harrison Walsh, I agreed to meet with Marcus at the Institute's offices, with clear boundaries about the purpose and scope of our conversation. Marcus Fletcher looked dramatically different from the confident executive I remembered from 5 years earlier. Federal prison had aged him significantly. His hair was completely gray, his face was lined with stress, and his posture suggested someone who had learned hard lessons about humility. But his eyes showed an intelligence and focus that seemed sharper than before. "Ms. Martinez," he said as we settled into my office, "I want to begin by thanking you for agreeing to see me. I know this meeting is difficult for you, and I appreciate your willingness to consider my transition plans." "What are your plans?" "I want to continue working on intellectual property protection. But I understand that my criminal background limits my options. I'm prepared to work as a researcher, consultant, or trainer, whatever role allows me to contribute meaningfully to prevention efforts." "And financially?" "I have no assets left from my previous career. Everything was forfeited for victim restitution. I'll be starting over completely, probably working minimum wage jobs while building credibility in IP protection work." I studied his face, looking for signs of the arrogance and manipulation that had characterized his previous personality. Instead, I saw someone who seemed genuinely committed to making amends for his past actions. "Marcus, why is this work important to you now?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because I understand the damage that intellectual property theft causes better than anyone. I destroyed careers, stole innovations, and corrupted the innovation process for personal gain. I can't undo that damage. But I can try to prevent others from experiencing what I put people through. What would you want from me or the Institute? Nothing more than what I've already received, the Opportunity to contribute research and insights to prevention efforts. I don't expect employment, endorsements, or reputation rehabilitation. I just want to be useful in protecting intellectual property rights. Our conversation continued for another hour, covering his research plans, his transition challenges, and his long-term goals. By the end, I found myself cautiously optimistic about his commitment to prevention work, though still wary of his potential for manipulation. "Marcus," I said as our meeting concluded, "I'm willing to continue our research collaboration, but with clear boundaries. Your work will always be credited with full disclosure of your criminal background. You'll have no formal role with the Institute. And our relationship will remain strictly professional." I understand and accept those conditions completely. After Marcus left, I sat alone in my office reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this point. 6 years ago, he had been the successful executive who stole my ideas and nearly destroyed my career. Today, he was a former federal prisoner seeking to make amends by helping protect the intellectual property rights of others. The transformation was remarkable. But I remained cautious about trusting someone who had demonstrated such sophisticated capacity for deception. Time would reveal whether his commitment to prevention work was genuine or simply another form of manipulation. Dr. Valdez stopped by my office that evening to discuss the meeting. "How did it go?" "Better than I expected, but I'm still skeptical. Marcus is obviously intelligent and apparently committed to this work. But he's also a proven liar and manipulator. It's hard to know what to believe." "What does your instinct tell you?" "That he's probably sincere about wanting to make amends. But that his motives are complex. He may genuinely want to protect IP rights. But he also wants to rebuild some semblance of professional respectability. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Not if his work is genuinely helpful and he's honest about his background. But we need to be careful not to let our desire for his insights override our skepticism about his character." Over the following months, Marcus proved himself through consistent, high-quality research contributions. He worked part-time as a night janitor to support himself while spending his days analyzing intellectual property theft cases and developing prevention strategies. His insights continued to be valuable, and his commitment appeared genuine. But the real test came when Marcus was offered a consulting position with a major corporation that had implemented our training programs. The company was unaware of his criminal background and was impressed by his expertise in intellectual property protection. Marcus declined the position and instead contacted me to discuss the ethical implications of accepting employment based on expertise gained through criminal activity. "I could probably take the job without them ever discovering my background," he told me during one of our regular check-in calls. "But that would be another form of deception. And I've caused enough harm through dishonesty. What will you do instead? Continue the research work and see if any organizations are willing to employ someone with my background openly. If not, I'll find other ways to contribute to IP protection efforts." His decision to reject the consulting opportunity convinced me that his commitment to ethical behavior was probably genuine. A manipulative person would have taken the job and hidden his criminal history. Someone genuinely committed to making amends would choose transparency over opportunity. 6 months later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation offered Marcus a unique position, civilian contractor specializing in intellectual property theft investigations. The position required full disclosure of his criminal background but utilized his expertise in understanding theft methodologies. "It's perfect for him," Agent Morrison told me when discussing the offer. "He understands how thieves think because he was one. But his criminal conviction means he'll never be trusted with sensitive information or independent authority. He can contribute insights without compromising security." Marcus accepted the FBI position, bringing his strange journey from intellectual property thief to theft prevention specialist full circle. His first assignment was developing training materials for investigators working on cases similar to his own, systematic theft operations that had operated undetected for years. As I watched Marcus begin his new career, I reflected on the complex lessons his story provided about justice, redemption, and the possibility of transformation. His theft had been devastating for me and others, but his expertise gained through criminal activity was now being used to protect future victims. The situation challenged simple notions of justice and punishment. Marcus had served his sentence, paid restitution to his victims, and was now contributing valuable work to prevention efforts. But he would always be a convicted felon whose professional reputation was permanently damaged by his criminal choices. "It's not a perfect ending," I told Dr. Valdez during one of our regular conversations about the case. "But it might be the best possible outcome given the circumstances. Marcus can contribute to prevention efforts without ever again being in a position to steal intellectual property." Do you feel like justice has been served? I think justice is being served on an ongoing basis. Marcus was punished for his crimes, his victims were compensated, and new systems were created to prevent similar theft. Now he's contributing to those prevention efforts in a way that acknowledges his past while potentially protecting future victims. Any regrets about how this all developed? I considered her question while looking out at the city where my career had been transformed by Marcus's theft 6 years earlier. No regrets about fighting back or seeking justice. Some ambivalence about collaborating with him. But the work is too important to let personal feelings override practical benefits. What would you tell other theft victims about forgiveness and redemption? That they're personal choices, not obligations. You don't have to forgive someone who harmed you, but sometimes forgiveness serves your own interests better than carrying anger. And redemption is possible for almost anyone, but it requires genuine commitment to making amends rather than just rebuilding reputation. As our conversation ended, I thought about the extraordinary arc that had transformed my stolen promotion into a national career in intellectual property protection. Marcus Fletcher's theft had nearly destroyed my professional life. But it had also revealed capabilities I never knew I possessed and launched a calling that exceeded my wildest ambitions. The best revenge, I had learned, wasn't destroying your enemy or even seeing them punished. It was taking their attack and using it to build something better, stronger, and more protective than what existed before. Sometimes the greatest victories emerge from the deepest betrayals. If you have the courage to fight back and the wisdom to transform pain into purpose. Marcus had tried to steal my future, but he had inadvertently helped me discover my destiny. In the end, that might be the most poetic justice of all. 10 years after Marcus Fletcher first stole my ideas, I stood before the Supreme Court of the United States, preparing to argue a case that would determine the future of intellectual property protection in corporate America. The case, Martinez v. Tech Global Industries, involved systematic theft of employee innovations on an unprecedented scale. The legal principles established by my original case against Marcus had evolved into comprehensive federal law. But corporate thieves had adapted their methods to exploit remaining loopholes. Today's argument would determine whether those loopholes would be closed or whether intellectual property theft would be legitimized as acceptable business practice. Ms. Martinez, Chief Justice Roberts began, you argue that corporations have an affirmative duty to protect employee intellectual property, not merely a negative duty to avoid theft. What is the constitutional basis for this distinction? Your Honor, I replied, the Constitution grants Congress power to protect intellectual property rights. And employee innovations represent the foundation of American competitiveness. When corporations systematically appropriate employee ideas without attribution or compensation, they undermine the very innovation incentives the Constitution was designed to protect. The oral argument continued for an hour, with justices asking detailed questions about the scope of corporate responsibility, the definition of employee intellectual property, and the practical implications of enhanced protection requirements. Justice Barrett raised a concern that had been central to the case, Ms. Martinez. Don't most employment contracts already give companies rights to employee innovations? How do we distinguish between legitimate corporate ownership and illegitimate theft? Justice Barrett, the key distinction is attribution and compensation. Legitimate corporate ownership includes clear attribution to the employee inventor and appropriate compensation for valuable innovations. Theft occurs when companies appropriate ideas while denying credit or compensation to their creators. As I left the Supreme Court that afternoon, I reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought me from stolen analyst to constitutional advocate. The case wouldn't be decided for months. But the fact that intellectual property protection had reached the nation's highest court demonstrated how far the movement had progressed. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Valdez. Watched the argument online. Brilliant advocacy. Whatever the court decides, you've already transformed IP protection forever. That evening, I returned to my hotel room and called my parents to update them on the case. They had followed my career transformation with amazement and pride, but they still sometimes seemed surprised that their daughter was arguing cases before the Supreme Court. "Mija," my mother said, "your grandmother would have been so proud. She always said that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when the fight seems impossible." "Do you think I'll win?" "You've already won," my father replied. 10 years ago, no one took intellectual property theft seriously. Now it's federal law with Supreme Court cases. Win or lose, you've changed how America protects innovation. The Supreme Court decision came 4 months later, 7-2 in favor of comprehensive intellectual property protection, with the majority opinion citing the Martinez precedent as foundational to modern IP law. Corporations would now be required to maintain clear attribution and provide appropriate compensation for valuable employee innovations. But perhaps more satisfying than the legal victory was a letter I received the following week from Marcus Fletcher, now 5 years into his work with the FBI. "Ms. Martinez, I wanted you to know that the Supreme Court decision has already impacted our investigation work. We've opened 12 new cases of systematic IP theft that were previously considered legal under existing corporate ownership doctrines. More importantly, the decision validates the principle you've fought for throughout your career, that intellectual property rights belong to creators, not just to the organizations that employ them. I continue to find meaning in helping prevent the kind of theft I once committed. Your willingness to accept my research contributions despite our history has been crucial to my efforts at redemption. Thank you for transforming personal injustice into societal progress. Respectfully, Marcus Fletcher." I set the letter aside and looked around my office at the National Intellectual Property Protection Institute. The walls were covered with awards, commendations, and photographs from congressional hearings, Supreme Court arguments, and international conferences. But the most meaningful decoration was a simple framed quote from my grandmother: "Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Marcus Fletcher had tried to steal my future 10 years ago. Instead, he had inadvertently launched a career that exceeded my wildest dreams and a movement that had transformed intellectual property protection throughout American business. His theft had been devastating at the time, but it had also revealed possibilities I never could have imagined. The best revenge, I had learned, wasn't destroying your enemy or even seeing them punished. It was taking their attack and using it to build something better, stronger, and more just than what existed before. Sometimes the greatest victories emerge from the deepest betrayals, if you have the courage to fight back and the wisdom to transform pain into purpose. Marcus had tried to steal my ideas and destroy my career. Instead, he had helped me discover my calling and change the world. In the end, that might be the most perfect justice of all, not because he was punished, but because his crime became the foundation for protecting countless others from experiencing the same injustice. The hollow feeling I had experienced during his initial downfall was long gone, replaced by deep satisfaction with work that mattered, relationships that sustained me, and the knowledge that my struggle had created lasting protections for future innovators. Justice, I had learned, wasn't just about punishment or revenge. It was about transformation, of systems, of laws, of culture, and sometimes even of the people who had caused the initial harm. Marcus Fletcher remained a convicted felon whose reputation would never fully recover, but he had also become an unlikely ally in the fight against intellectual property theft. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I thought about all the employees across America who were working late in laboratories, offices, and workshops, developing innovations that could change industries and improve lives. Thanks to the movement that began with my stolen promotion, those innovators now had stronger protections, clearer rights, and better recourse if their ideas were stolen. That was legacy enough for any career, and redemption enough for any injustice. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't revenge, it's building a world where such betrayals become impossible to sustain. That's the world Marcus Fletcher's theft had helped me create, one case, one law, one protected innovation at a time.